Aliyah Ice Harper was a force of nature. People around her, both friend and foe, recognized her as a woman who commanded respect without ever raising her voice. She was the kind of person who could walk into a room and, without saying a word, make everyone aware of her presence. As the leader of the biker gang known as the Black Steel Brotherhood, Aliyah had built her reputation over the years as a fiercely loyal protector of her friends and a relentless fighter for justice. Her gang, a close-knit group of diverse, fearless individuals, was known not only for their fierce rides but also for their efforts to keep their community safe. For them, being bikers wasn't about rebellion or lawlessness, it was about unity, strength, and a shared mission to stand up for those who couldn't stand up for themselves. Tonight, however, Aliyah was far from her usual commanding role. She wasn't clad in leather or sporting the gang's emblem. Instead, she wore simple clothes, a faded jean jacket over a dark shirt and black jeans that hugged her lean, muscular frame. With her thick, dark curls pulled back and a casual, unassuming look, she could have been mistaken for any ordinary woman out for an evening walk, and in a way that was exactly what she was doing. The day had been exhausting, filled with endless meetings, errands, and the small but constant issues that came with leading a group of people with strong personalities and lives of their own. She needed a break, a few moments of quiet where she could recharge and think. As she strolled through the city park, Aliyah felt the cool evening air against her skin. She closed her eyes briefly, taking in the faint scent of blooming flowers and freshly cut grass. The park was peaceful at this hour, the last rays of sunlight casting a warm glow over the trees and empty benches. Most people had already left, leaving behind a quiet that Aliyah found strangely comforting. For the first time in days, she felt a sense of calm wash over her. She inhaled deeply, her hands in her pockets, and let herself relax, if only for a few minutes. Unbeknownst to her, however, someone else was watching. Officer Tom Branson sat in his patrol car on the far side of the park, eyes locked onto Aliyah's solitary figure. Branson had been a police officer for over a decade, and during that time he'd built a reputation that was feared as much as it was resented. He was the type who didn't just enforce the law, he bent it to suit his own twisted sense of order. For him, power wasn't a responsibility, it was a weapon, a way to control and punish anyone he deemed out of place. Over the years, his unchecked authority had turned into something dark and dangerous, feeding his resentment toward anyone he perceived as a threat or challenge to his authority. Today had been a particularly bad day for Branson. Personal problems had been mounting, making him feel as though the ground was slipping from beneath him. His marriage was crumbling, his debts were growing, and his once stellar record was marred by a series of internal complaints that he barely managed to keep under wraps. And here he was, stuck on a routine patrol shift, with nothing to do but seethe in his own frustration. Then he noticed Aliyah, a solitary figure in the park, minding her own business, but, in his eyes, completely out of place. Branson watched her with narrowed eyes, his frustration bubbling into anger. A young black woman, alone, walking confidently through a part of town he thought she didn't belong in. She didn't look like a troublemaker, but to Branson that didn't matter. His biases, deeply rooted and never challenged, painted a different picture. He convinced himself that she had to be up to something, and the more he thought about it, the angrier he became. Who did she think she was, strolling through his territory as if she owned it? Without a second thought, Branson turned on the patrol car's lights and pulled up alongside her, cutting off her path. The sudden flash of lights made Aliyah blink, and she instinctively tensed. She'd been through situations like this before, enough times to recognize that something was off. But she wasn't about to show fear. She knew that standing her ground was often the only defense she had in encounters like these. "Evening, officer," she said, her voice calm and steady as she looked up at him. Branson stepped out of the car, his tall frame looming as he walked toward her, his expression hard and unreadable. He didn't respond to her greeting. Instead, he stood there, sizing her up with a look that was both disdainful and predatory. "Mind telling me what you're doing out here?" His voice was low, almost a growl, as if he was daring her to answer wrong. Alia raised an eyebrow, not intimidated but wary. "Just out for a walk. It's a public park, last I checked." Branson's jaw tightened at her response, and a flicker of something dangerous crossed his face. He hated it when people like her confident, unafraid didn't immediately cower. It felt like a challenge, an insult to his authority. "Don't get smart with me," he snapped, stepping closer. "I asked you a question, and I expect an answer." Alia didn't flinch, but she could feel the tension in the air intensifying. She kept her voice even, refusing to let him see any sign of discomfort. "I've given you my answer. I'm just taking a walk." Branson's gaze darkened. "Let me see some ID." She hesitated, knowing she hadn't done anything wrong and that this was nothing more than harassment. But experience had taught her that pushing back too hard, too soon, could escalate things quickly. She slowly reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out her ID, handing it to him without a word. Branson snatched it from her hand, his fingers brushing hers briefly, the touch colder and more hostile than necessary. He examined the ID, though it was clear he was hardly paying attention to the information on it. He was too focused on her, on the idea that she somehow didn't belong here. In his mind, he'd already decided that she was a troublemaker, that she was defying him by merely existing in his sight. "This your neighborhood?" he asked, his tone dripping with disdain. Alia met his gaze steadily. "I live nearby. Not that it should matter." Branson's lips curled into a sneer. "It matters when I say it does." He threw her ID back at her, and she caught it with a practiced, steady hand, refusing to break eye contact. Every word, every gesture from him was designed to provoke, to assert dominance. But Alia wasn't giving him the satisfaction of a reaction. "Look, officer, I'm not doing anything wrong. I don't want any trouble," she said, still maintaining her calm. She wasn't naive. She knew exactly what he was doing, and she knew how dangerous it could be to give in to anger. This man was looking for a reason to escalate things, and she wasn't going to hand it to him. But Branson wasn't interested in her compliance. Her calmness, her refusal to bow to his intimidation, only enraged him further. It felt like a personal slight, a direct insult to his authority. He stepped closer, invading her personal space, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "Trouble isn't something you get to choose. I'll decide if there's trouble, and right now I think there is." The threat hung heavy in the air, a promise of violence barely concealed by his uniform. Alia held her ground, her heartbeat steady but her senses on high alert. She'd seen men like Branson before, authority figures who used their power not to protect, but to intimidate, to crush anyone who dared to challenge them, or even simply exist outside of their narrow expectations. Men like him weren't interested in justice, they were only interested in control. She could see it in the way he stood, the way his hand hovered near his belt, fingers flexing as if itching for an excuse to reach for his weapon. The park around them was empty, the fading daylight casting long shadows across the trees and pathways. The stillness seemed to amplify every word, every shift in his posture, and she was painfully aware that they were alone. But despite the vulnerability of the moment, Alia refused to let fear dictate her actions. Her entire life had been a battle against people who underestimated her, People who saw her as nothing more than the color of her skin or the strength of her voice. She wasn't about to let this man undo her resolve. Branson's sneer deepened, his jaw clenched as if barely containing his frustration. He hated her calmness, her refusal to shrink under his gaze. To him, her defiance was infuriating, almost insolent. It was as though she was daring him to push harder, and he was more than willing to rise to the challenge. "I don't think you understand the situation you're in," he hissed, stepping even closer, so close that Aliyah could see the flecks of rage in his eyes. "When I ask you a question, I expect a straightforward answer. No attitude, no sauce." Aliyah kept her expression neutral, though the bile was rising in her throat. "I've given you all the answers you need, officer. I'm out for a walk, and I haven't done anything wrong." Branson's hand shot out, and before she could react, he grabbed her wrist, his grip painfully tight. "You think you're untouchable? Ha! You think that just because you're out here on a little walk, I can't do my job and keep an eye on people like you?" "Let go of me," Aliyah said, her voice steady but with an edge of steel. She wasn't asking, she was demanding. Yet she knew this only further fueled his aggression. Branson smirked, tightening his grip, almost savoring her resistance. "Or what? You're going to make a scene? I don't see anyone around here to help you. And even if they were, who do you think they'd believe? A respectable officer of the law or you?" The threat in his words was unmistakable. He was daring her to resist, to fight back, knowing that he held all the power. Aliyah felt a flare of anger ignite in her chest, a fury she'd carefully learned to control over the years. This wasn't the first time she'd encountered a man who thought he could put her in her place, who saw her as a threat simply for existing. But she also knew that reacting emotionally now could give him the excuse he was looking for to escalate the situation beyond control. She met his gaze, her dark eyes sharp and unyielding. "You have no reason to detain me. Let go." Branson's smirk faded, replaced by something darker, more dangerous. In that moment, he decided he was done with subtle intimidation. If she wasn't going to break easily, he was going to show her exactly what happened to people who didn't show him the respect he thought he deserved. "Fine," he spat, releasing her wrist only to grab her shoulder with brutal force, shoving her backward. She stumbled, but managed to catch herself, maintaining her balance. Her eyes flashed with warning, but he was past listening. The encounter had become personal. It was no longer about a simple interaction, but about putting her in her place. "Is this how you treat every person you meet in the park?" Aliyah asked, her voice low and fierce, even as she felt the sharp ache from his grip. "People like you don't belong here," Branson snarled, stepping closer again. "Walking around like you own the place, thinking you can do whatever you want. But not on my watch." Before Aliyah could respond, Branson's hand shot out again, this time grabbing her arm with enough force to bruise. The pain radiated up her shoulder, but she gritted her teeth, refusing to show any sign of weakness. She knew that any reaction he saw would only embolden him. "You don't get to act like you're above the law," he growled, his face mere inches from hers. "You think you're some kind of queen? Some kind of untouchable? Let me show you just how wrong you are." In a sudden, shocking move, Branson twisted her arm behind her back, forcing her down toward the ground. The sharp sting of pain shot through her shoulder, and despite herself, a hiss of discomfort escaped her lips. Branson, hearing the sound, seemed to relish it, as though it validated his warped sense of control. "Stay down," he ordered, shoving her even harder, pressing her face closer to the dirt. "Maybe this will teach you some respect." Aliyah's mind raced. She knew she had to keep her composure, to not give him any reason to escalate even further. She felt the cold ground beneath her cheek, her heartbeat pounding in her ears, each beat a reminder of the control she still had over herself, if not the situation. But as she lay there, she knew that the situation had gone too far to simply back down now. Branson was looking for an excuse, any excuse, to push her over the edge, and if she wasn't careful, things could turn deadly. But she wasn't alone. Unbeknownst to Branson, a shadowy figure had been watching from the edge of the park, unnoticed in the growing darkness. One of her crew members, a trusted friend and ally, had seen the encounter unfold. He had initially kept his distance, uncertain if Aliyah needed help, knowing how fiercely independent she was. But as he watched Branson's actions become increasingly aggressive, something in him snapped. He couldn't just stand by and watch this abuse of power continue unchecked. Keeping to the shadows, he pulled out his phone and sent a quick, coded message to the rest of the gang. Code read, "Ace needs us. Now." Back on the ground, Aliyah felt a sudden, unfamiliar sense of relief, knowing that her friends would soon be on their way. She didn't know how much longer she could hold her ground against Branson, but she was determined to try. She lifted her head slightly, her gaze defiant even from her vulnerable position. "Is this what makes you feel powerful?" she asked, her voice steady, laced with contempt. "Beating down someone who's done nothing wrong. Does that make you feel like a man?" Branson's face twisted with rage, and he pressed her harder into the ground, his grip punishing. "You don't get to question me," he spat. "You don't get to talk back." He leaned down, his voice a low, threatening whisper in her ear. "You think you're special? That your little gang of misfits makes you untouchable? They can't save you. No one can." Aliyah's lips curved into a defiant, almost mocking smile. "You're about to find out just how wrong you are." The words were barely out of her mouth when the distant roar of motorcycle engines shattered the silence of the park. The sound grew louder, a thunderous rumble that echoed off the trees, filling the air with an unmistakable presence. Branson's head shot up, a flicker of confusion and fear flashing across his face as he realized what was coming. One by one, headlights appeared in the distance, cutting through the growing darkness as the members of the Black Steel Brotherhood made their way into the park. They moved in formation, an unbreakable wall of bikes and leather, and their expressions, visible even from a distance, were deadly serious. There was no mistaking the look in their eyes, a promise of retribution, of justice for their leader. Branson's hand twitched, his grip on Aliyah loosening as he watched the bikers approach. For the first time, a sliver of doubt crept into his mind. He had thought he held all the power, that he was untouchable. But now, facing the unwavering loyalty and unity of Aliyah's friends, he began to realize just how alone he truly was. And Aliyah, still on the ground, couldn't help but smile. The roaring engines grew louder, filling the park with a low, thunderous hum that seemed to vibrate through the air itself. The Black Steel Brotherhood was closing in, each rider determined and silent, their headlights cutting through the dimming evening light like beams of justice. There were nearly a dozen of them, each one clad in their own unique style, but all wearing the same symbol of loyalty, a patch on their jackets, displaying a black steel fist surrounded by a wreath of flames. It was a powerful image, one that struck fear into anyone who dared to stand against them. Branson straightened up, his face a twisted mask of anger and defiance, though Aliyah could see the flash of fear in his eyes. He hadn't anticipated this. He thought he could intimidate her alone, with no one around to witness his abuse of power. But now, confronted by her friends, his grip on the situation was slipping. He looked down at Aliyah, still holding her in his tight grip, though the pressure had eased. She met his gaze with a steady, unwavering look, one that conveyed a quiet strength and a warning. This wasn't over, and she wasn't alone. "Looks like your friends are here," Branson sneered, though his voice wavered slightly. He glanced over his shoulder as the bikers surrounded him in a wide circle, their expressions dark and threatening. "What's this? Your little gang come to rescue you." Aliyah didn't respond. She knew that anything she said would only fuel his anger, and she was done playing his games. She felt the ache in her shoulder and the sting of the gravel beneath her, but she remained calm, trusting that her friends would know exactly how to handle the situation. The bikers parked their motorcycles in a deliberate, strategic formation, creating an impenetrable barrier around Branson. The silence that followed was oppressive, a heavy, loaded quiet that seemed to suffocate the air. Each biker sat astride their machine, watching him intently, their eyes filled with a silent fury. They didn't need to say anything. Their presence alone was enough to make a statement. One of the bikers stepped forward, removing his helmet to reveal a rugged face lined with experience and resolve. This was Dex, Aliyah's second in command and one of her oldest friends. He was a former soldier, a man who had seen and survived battles that would have broken lesser men. His loyalty to Aliyah was unbreakable, and he was known among the Brotherhood for his fierce sense of justice and calm, calculated demeanor. Tonight, however, there was nothing calm about him. His eyes were locked on Branson, unblinking and unyielding, as if daring him to make the next move. "Officer," Dex said, his voice steady but carrying a cold edge that hinted at barely restrained rage. "You're going to release her now." Branson's sneer deepened, though there was a glimmer of uncertainty in his eyes. He was used to holding power over others, to having his authority unquestioned. But tonight he was outnumbered. Facing a group of people who clearly didn't fear him or his badge, he glanced around, weighing his options, but his pride wouldn't let him back down so easily. "Is that a threat?" Branson retorted, trying to maintain a veneer of confidence. "You think you and your little biker gang scare me? You're all just a bunch of criminals hiding behind your leather jackets and motorcycles." Dex's expression didn't change. He took another step forward, his eyes never leaving Branson's. "This isn't a threat. It's a fact. You're out of line, officer. And if you don't release her, you'll be facing consequences that your badge won't protect you from." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd of bikers, a low rumble that sent a chill down Branson's spine. He felt the weight of their gaze, the collective anger of people who had seen enough injustice and weren't willing to tolerate it any longer. For the first time, he realized just how vulnerable he was, alone in the midst of people who had nothing to lose and everything to fight for. Branson's grip on Aliyah loosened slightly, but he still held her arm, as if clinging to the last shred of his authority. He glanced around, his mind racing as he tried to find a way out of this without appearing weak. He didn't want to back down, not in front of them, not after everything he'd done to assert his control. But he was also acutely aware that any misstep could ignite a confrontation he wasn't prepared for. "Back off," Branson snarled, his voice rising as he tried to reassert his dominance. "I'm a police officer, and you're all interfering with an arrest. That's obstruction of justice. So if you don't want to spend the night in a cell, I suggest you leave. Now." Dex didn't move. His stance remained firm, his eyes fixed on Branson with an intensity that bordered on deadly. "We're not going anywhere," he said, his tone colder than ice. "And you're not arresting anyone tonight. So either let her go, or we settle this right here." Branson's eyes darted around, calculating. He was outnumbered and he knew it, but his pride wouldn't let him simply surrender. The veins in his neck bulged as he struggled to contain his frustration, his fingers twitching with the urge to reach for his weapon. He could feel his authority slipping through his finger, and it enraged him. "You think you can scare me?" Branson spat, his voice filled with barely concealed hatred. "You think your gang of thugs can make me back down? I don't answer to you." At that, Dex's expression darkened. He took another step forward, his hands clenched into fists, his body language making it clear that he was done with words. "You're outnumbered, officer," he said, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "So unless you want this to get ugly, I suggest you make the smart choice and walk away." Branson's face twisted with rage. His hand shot to his holster, his fingers brushing the handle of his gun in a final attempt to intimidate them. The bikers tensed, their eyes narrowing as they watched his every move, ready to respond if he dared to draw his weapon. Alia, still on the ground, felt the tension escalate to a breaking point. She knew that if Branson pulled that gun, everything would spiral out of control. She couldn't let that happen. Summoning the strength she had left, she spoke up, her voice cutting through the thick silence like a blade. "Let me up, Branson," she demanded, her tone steady but firm. "You've lost control of this situation. You don't want to make things worse." Branson glared down at her, his face a mask of hatred and frustration. For a moment he looked as though he was going to ignore her, to continue his show of force. But the weight of the bikers' stares bore down on him, their silent threat as clear as day. He realized, grudgingly, that he was in over his head, that his authority meant nothing here. Reluctantly, he released her arm, taking a step back. Alia rose slowly, rubbing her bruised shoulder but never taking her eyes off him. She stood tall, unbroken despite everything he had put her through, and the strength in her gaze was undeniable. She didn't need to say anything more. Her resilience spoke volumes. "You're going to regret this," Branson snarled, his voice barely above a whisper as he backed away, his face twisted in anger and humiliation. "You think this is over? You think you can get away with this?" Alia met his gaze, her expression calm but filled with a quiet defiance. "This is just the beginning, Branson," she replied, her voice steady and unwavering. "You brought this on yourself." With that, Branson retreated, but not without a final, venomous glare at the bikers surrounding him. He knew that he couldn't win this fight tonight, not with the odds stacked against him. But in his mind, this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. He would find a way to turn the tables, to make them all pay for the humiliation they'd inflicted upon him. The bikers watched him go, their expressions a mixture of anger and satisfaction. They had stood their ground, defended one of their own, and forced Branson to back down. But they all knew that this was far from the end. Branson's retreat was temporary, a concession he made only because he had no other choice. As he walked back to his patrol car, he could feel the burning stares of the bikers on his back, each one a dagger of humiliation that pierced his pride. He'd been forced to let her go him, a seasoned officer, made to look weak in front of a gang of bikers he viewed as nothing more than scum. The bitter taste of defeat churned in his mouth, and with every step his anger grew, festering like an open wound. He knew he couldn't leave things like this. He couldn't just drive away, pretending that this hadn't happened. His reputation, his authority, they all depended on how he handled this moment. And so, as he reached his car, he made a silent vow. This wasn't over. He would come back for her and her whole gang, and he would make sure they regretted every second of this night. Inside the circle of motorcycles, Alia stood with her crew, still catching her breath. She could feel the ache in her shoulder and the sting of the rough treatment she'd endured, but she didn't let it show. Her eyes remained locked on Branson as he climbed into his car, her expression calm and unyielding, though a fire burned within her. She knew men like him. She knew the kind of person who couldn't tolerate losing, who would go to any lengths to restore their fragile sense of power. And she knew that the worst was yet to come. As Branson slammed the car door shut, he caught her gaze through the windshield. For a brief moment, their eyes met his filled with rage, hers with steely resolve. It was a silent standoff, a battle of wills that promised to spill over into something far more dangerous. Without breaking eye contact, Branson reached for the radio in his car, his expression twisting into a cruel smile as he spoke into the receiver. "Dispatch, this is Officer Branson," he said, his voice laced with barely contained fury. "I've got a situation here. Need backup at the park. Possible gang activity. Suspects are hostile and threatening an officer. Repeat, I need immediate assistance." He let go of the radio, still glaring at Aliyah through the windshield, knowing she could hear every word. His smile widened as he saw the flicker of realization cross her face. She knew exactly what he was doing, calling for reinforcements, spinning a story that painted her and her crew as aggressors, troublemakers who'd assaulted an officer. He was turning the narrative against them, twisting the truth to suit his needs. And in that moment, she understood the depth of his malice. The bikers around her stiffened, some exchanging glances of concern, while others clenched their fists, barely containing their own fury. They had anticipated resistance, yes, but they hadn't counted on Branson escalating things this way. Calling for backup meant more police, more potential for violence. It meant that their loyalty to Aliyah could put them all at risk. Dex stepped forward, his jaw set in a hard line as he watched Branson with open contempt. "He's bringing more cops," he said, his voice low and tense. "This bastard's not letting it go. He wants to make an example out of us." Aliyah nodded, her gaze still fixed on Branson's car. "He's too proud to admit he's in the wrong. He'd rather drag us all down than back off." She looked around at her crew, each of them a friend, a brother, a sister in arms. These were people who had stood by her through thick and thin, who had fought for each other and for the community they all cared about. She couldn't let them become collateral damage in Branson's twisted power play. "We need to be smart about this," she said, addressing her crew. "He's trying to provoke us, to get us to react so he can justify whatever he's about to do. But we're not giving him that satisfaction." A ripple of agreement went through the group, though the tension was palpable. They knew the stakes, understood that any wrong move could lead to violence or worse. But they also knew Aliyah, trusted her instincts, her leadership. If she said they needed to play it smart, they would follow her lead. Aliyah took a steadying breath, feeling the weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders. She was their leader, and every decision she made had to be calculated, precise. Branson was counting on her anger, on her pride, hoping she would lash out and give him the excuse he needed. But she wouldn't give him that satisfaction. Not tonight. "Dex, I need you and a few others to fan out," she said, formulating a plan as she spoke. "Don't look like you're leaving, but spread out enough that if things go south, we have some distance. Everyone else, stay close, but keep your hands where they can see them. No sudden movements." Dex nodded, his respect for her evident in his steady gaze. "Understood, Ace. We're with you." As they moved into position, Aliyah kept her eyes on Branson's car. She could see the headlights of additional police vehicles approaching in the distance, the telltale red and blue lights flashing against the darkening sky. Her jaw tightened. Branson had brought this fight to them, and he was going to use every tool at his disposal to make them pay for challenging him. Within minutes, 3 squad cars pulled up beside Branson's, and officers began to spill out, each one with a hand resting on their weapon as they surveyed the scene. Branson stepped out of his car, his expression smug as he gestured toward the bikers. his voice carrying over the quiet of the park. "There they are," he said, loud enough for all to hear. "Gang of troublemakers, causing a disturbance, threatening an officer. We need to get them under control." Alia felt her blood boil at his words. He was painting them as criminals, setting the stage for whatever violent action he had in mind. But she forced herself to stay calm, knowing that reacting now would only play into his hands. Instead, she stepped forward, holding her hands up to show she wasn't armed, her voice clear and steady as she addressed the officers. "We're not here to cause trouble," she said, looking each officer in the eye, hoping to reach at least one of them. "This officer," she gestured to Branson, "detained me without cause, used excessive force, and called for backup when we didn't back down. We're not the aggressors here. We're just standing our ground." A few of the officers exchanged glances, uncertain, but Branson quickly cut in, his voice dripping with authority and anger. "Don't listen to her. She's the leader of this gang, and she's trying to turn this into a standoff. We can't let them get away with this." The officers hesitated, torn between Branson's commands and the calm, composed manner in which Alia was speaking. She saw the doubt flicker in their eyes, and she seized the moment, taking a step closer and meeting their gaze directly. "We're not here to fight," she repeated, her voice firm. "But we're also not going to be bullied. We have rights, and we're not breaking any laws by standing here." Branson's face twisted with frustration, and he stepped in front of her, blocking her from the other officers. His voice dropped to a low, dangerous whisper, meant only for her ears. "You think you're clever, don't you? You think you can talk your way out of this?" Alia's gaze didn't waver. "I don't need to talk my way out of anything. You're the one who's crossed the line, and you know it." Branson's eyes narrowed, and she could see the fury simmering just beneath the surface. He was a man who had always relied on intimidation, on fear, to get what he wanted. And now, facing a group of people who refused to be intimidated, he was unraveling. One of the officers cleared his throat, drawing Branson's attention. "Sir, maybe we should just let them go. They're not causing any immediate threat, and it doesn't look like they're armed." Branson turned on the officer, his face contorted with barely controlled rage. "You're questioning my judgment, officer? You think you know better than me what a threat looks like." The officer shifted uncomfortably, glancing at Alia and her crew, then back at Branson. "No, sir. But if they're not doing anything illegal, maybe it's best to de-escalate. This could turn ugly fast." Alia could see the struggle in Branson's eyes, the realization that he was losing control not just over her but over his own men. It was a small victory, but it was one she would gladly take. She saw him clench his fists, his body rigid with barely contained fury as he turned back to her, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "This isn't over," he spat, his words laced with poison. "You may have won tonight, but I'll be watching you. And the second you step out of line, I'll be there to put you in your place." Alia met his gaze, her expression hard as steel. "I'm not afraid of you, Branson." "And neither are they," she said, nodding toward her crew. "We know our rights, we know the law, and we're not backing down." Branson's face turned a shade darker, but he knew he'd lost this round. With a final, hateful glare, he signaled for the other officers to back off, his expression promising retribution. As the squad cars began to disperse, he cast one last look at Alia, his eyes filled with a promise of vengeance. As he drove away, the bikers remained in place, watching him go. The tension lingered, but there was a palpable sense of victory in the air, a small but significant win in the face of intimidation. Alia stood tall, knowing this wasn't the end, but for tonight they had held their ground, and for now, that was enough. The next day, the morning air was thick with an unspoken tension. Alia awoke with a faint ache in her shoulder, a reminder of the previous night's events with Branson. Though she was grateful that they had managed to defuse the situation without any arrests or serious injuries, she couldn't shake the feeling that Branson wasn't done. She knew men like him. They didn't let go of grudges easily, especially after a public humiliation. To someone like Branson, being forced to back down had been a deep, personal wound, one that he would undoubtedly seek to avenge. As she dressed, her phone vibrated on the bedside table. It was a message from Dex. "Ace, we need to talk. Got word from a friend on the force. Branson's planning something. Meet us at the clubhouse." Aaliyah's jaw tightened as she read the message. She had expected some kind of retaliation from Branson, but the idea that he was actively plotting against them so soon only confirmed her worst suspicions. She grabbed her jacket and helmet, her mind already racing through potential scenarios and how they could prepare. She wasn't about to let him catch them off guard. The clubhouse of the Black Steel Brotherhood was tucked away in a discreet corner of the city, an old industrial building they'd converted into a fortress of sorts. To an outsider, it looked like a rundown garage, but to the Brotherhood, it was a sanctuary, a place of camaraderie, loyalty, and trust. When she arrived, several members were already there, talking in low voices, their faces serious. Dex approached her as soon as she stepped inside, his expression tense. "Ace, we've got a problem." "Tell me," she replied, her voice steady, though her eyes held a spark of anger. Dex glanced around, ensuring everyone was listening. "I've got a buddy in the precinct. He says Branson's been going around, rallying other officers, telling them we're a menace to the community and that we attacked him. He's spinning the story to make it look like we're some violent gang out to target cops. He's even pulled in a few officers who owe him favors, and they're all buying his version." A murmur of disbelief and anger rippled through the group. Aaliyah clenched her fists, her mind racing. Branson was weaponizing the very system he was supposed to uphold, using his badge to rally support for a personal vendetta. She'd known he was dangerous, but this was beyond anything she had anticipated. "What's he planning?" she asked, her voice calm but laced with a steely resolve. Dex shook his head. "All I know is he's been talking about cleaning up the streets and sending a message. My contact thinks he's planning a raid on us. He's using last night as an excuse to justify it, calling us an organized threat." Aaliyah felt a surge of anger and frustration. Branson had twisted the events of the previous night to paint her and her crew as criminals, manipulating his fellow officers into believing his lies. And now he was planning to bring the full force of the law down on them, using his badge to disguise a personal vendetta as a legitimate crackdown. "We can't let him do this," she said, her voice cold and determined. "If he comes after us like this, it won't just be about last night. He's going to try to ruin us, to tear us apart. We need to be ready." A tall, muscular biker named Rick spoke up, his voice a low growl. "Ace, if he brings the cops down on us, it's going to be a fight. They'll be looking for any excuse to take us in or worse." Aaliyah nodded, meeting each of their gazes in turn. "I know, but we're not backing down. We'll defend ourselves, but we're doing this smart. No violence unless we have no other choice. We don't give them any reason to escalate." The Brotherhood murmured their agreement, though there was an undercurrent of tension. They were fighters, every one of them, and the idea of standing defensively against a hostile force didn't sit well with all of them. But they trusted Aaliyah, trusted her judgment, and they knew that she was right. If they went in guns blazing, it would only validate everything Branson had said about them. They had to be smarter than him, more controlled. Over the next few hours, they fortified the clubhouse, reinforcing doors and windows, making sure they had multiple escape routes if things went south. They gathered in small groups, strategizing, discussing contingency plans and preparing for the worst. The tension in the air was palpable, a mix of fear, anger, and determination. They knew what was coming, and they were ready to face it. As evening fell, the Brotherhood gathered in the main room, waiting in silence. Aliyah stood at the front, her gaze steady as she looked over her crew. She felt a deep sense of pride and loyalty toward each of them. These people weren't just her friends, they were her family, and she would do everything in her power to protect them. Suddenly, the sound of sirens echoed in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. The Brotherhood tensed, their hands instinctively reaching for whatever they could use to defend themselves. They could see the flashing red and blue lights approaching, illuminating the darkening sky like a storm on the horizon. "They're here," Dex said quietly, his voice tense. Aliyah took a deep breath, steadying herself. She looked at her crew, her voice calm but firm. "Remember, stay calm, stay together. We're not giving them anything they can use against us. Let's show them who we are." With that, she stepped outside, flanked by Dex and a few others. They stood in a line, waiting as the police vehicles screeched to a halt in front of the clubhouse. Branson was the first to step out, his face twisted into a sneer of satisfaction. Behind him, a dozen officers followed, their expressions hard and unreadable, their hands hovering near their weapons. "Well, well," Branson said, his voice dripping with contempt. "Look at this, our little gang, all lined up for inspection. How thoughtful." Aliyah didn't flinch, her gaze steady as she faced him. "What do you want, Branson?" He smirked, taking a step closer. "What I want, Ms. Harper, is to clean up my streets. You and your little band of outlaws have been causing enough trouble. Last night was the final straw. I'm here to make sure you understand the consequences of messing with the law." Aliyah's jaw tightened, but she kept her composure. "We're not criminals, Branson. We're not out here causing trouble. Last night you came after me without cause, used excessive force, and now you're trying to cover it up by painting us as the bad guys." Branson laughed, a cruel, mocking sound. "Cover it up? Sweetheart, you've got it all wrong." "I don't need to cover anything up. All I have to do is make sure everyone sees you for what you really are, a gang of thugs, hiding behind your little clubhouse." He turned to the officers behind him, raising his voice. "These people are a menace to our community. They think they're above the law, that they can intimidate and threaten officers without consequence. Well, tonight we show them otherwise." The officers shifted, some looking uncertain, others nodding in agreement. Aliyah could see that Branson's influence ran deep, that he had twisted the story so thoroughly that many of these men genuinely believed they were here to protect the community from a dangerous gang. But she could also see the hesitation in a few faces, the doubt that flickered in their eyes. They weren't all convinced, and she knew that was something she could work with. "Is this really what you signed up for?" she called out, directing her voice to the officers rather than Branson. "To be used as pawns in a personal vendetta? To attack people who haven't broken any laws just because one man has a grudge?" Branson's face darkened, and he stepped forward, his hand moving toward his weapon. "That's enough, Harper. You're under arrest. All of you are under arrest for obstruction of justice, for disturbing the peace, and for assaulting an officer." Dex took a step forward, his expression defiant. "None of that's true, and you know it." Branson's gaze snapped to Dex, his eyes blazing with hatred. "Oh, I know exactly what you are," he spat. "You're nothing but a gang of criminals, hiding behind your so-called Brotherhood. But that ends tonight." Without warning, he gestured to the officers, and a few of them moved forward, reaching for Aliyah and Dex. The Brotherhood tensed, and a few instinctively clenched their fists, but Aliyah held up a hand, signaling them to hold back. "We're not resisting," she said, her voice clear and calm. "We haven't done anything wrong. If you arrest us, you'll be breaking the law, and we'll fight this in court." Branson's smirk widened. "Oh, I don't think you'll be seeing a courtroom anytime soon. People like you don't get justice. People like you get exactly what they deserve." Alia could feel the fury boiling inside her, but she forced herself to stay calm. She knew that Branson was baiting her, trying to provoke her into a reaction. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction. But as Branson and his officers moved in, something unexpected happened. One of the younger officers stepped forward, blocking Branson's path. His face was pale, his expression conflicted, but his voice was steady. "Sir, this isn't right," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "They're not resisting. They're just standing there. We can't arrest them without cause." Branson turned on him, his face a mask of fury. "Are you questioning my orders, officer?" The young man held his ground, though Alia could see the fear in his eyes. "I'm just saying we need to do this by the book. If we go in without cause, it's going to come back on us, on all of us." For a brief moment, a stunned silence fell over the scene. Alia could see the doubt spreading among the officers, a ripple of uncertainty that weakened Branson's control. A heavy silence fell over the street as Branson glared at the young officer who had dared to question him. For a moment it seemed as if he might explode, his face contorted with rage. His hand twitched toward his holster, and Alia felt her heart pound in her chest, knowing how close they were to a violent outcome. Yet, she also saw a flicker of hesitation in the eyes of the officers standing behind Branson. Doubt was seeping in, a crack forming in the wall of his control. Branson clenched his fists, trying to regain his composure. He turned his furious gaze back to Alia, his eyes narrowing with barely concealed malice. "You think this changes anything, Harper? You think a little rebellion from some rookie is going to stop me from doing my job?" Alia met his gaze without flinching. She knew that this was the moment that would define the outcome of everything they had fought for: their dignity, their freedom, their right to stand up against corruption. And she wasn't about to back down. "No, Branson," she said, her voice steady and clear, carrying an unmistakable authority. "What's going to stop you is the truth. You can't keep using your badge to bully and intimidate people. This ends now." The defiance in her voice seemed to ignite something in the other officers. One by one, they began to step back, creating distance between themselves and Branson, their reluctance visible in their faces. They weren't ready to go along with his vendetta. Not when the people they were supposed to be targeting were standing calmly, peacefully, refusing to fight. "You're making a mistake," Branson hissed, turning to the officers who were stepping back. His voice was desperate, almost pleading. "These people are criminals. They don't belong here. They're a threat. And if you don't do something about it now, they'll keep coming back." But the officers didn't move. They exchanged uncertain glances, some muttering quietly to each other. The young officer who had initially questioned Branson's orders looked directly at Alia, his expression a mix of respect and shame. He lowered his head, clearly conflicted, but unwilling to be part of a lie. Realizing he was losing control, Branson's desperation turned to fury. His hand shot to his gun, yanking it from the holster, and in an instant he had it trained on Alia. The Brotherhood tensed, instinctively moving forward to protect her, but Alia raised a hand, stopping them. She didn't break eye contact with Branson, didn't let him see even a flicker of fear. "This is your last warning, Harper," Branson said, his voice trembling with rage and frustration. "You think you're so tough, hiding behind these thugs. But I'm the law here, and I'll do whatever it takes to maintain order." Alia's voice was calm, almost gentle. "You're not the law, Branson. You're just a man who let power go to his head. And right now, you're standing alone." Branson's gaze flickered, his grip on the gun tightening. He glanced around, finally registering the reality of the situation. He was outnumbered, outmatched, and the officers who had once supported him were now standing apart, looking at him with a mixture of fear and disgust. His face twisted in anger and humiliation, his last shreds of control slipping away. "You're making a mistake, all of you," Branson shouted, his voice cracking. "You don't know who you're dealing with. I've kept this town safe. I've protected all of you." One of the older officers stepped forward, his expression weary. "No, Tom," he said, his voice heavy with disappointment. "You protected yourself. You used your badge as a weapon, and you hurt innocent people. That's not the kind of officer I signed up to be." Branson's face drained of color, the reality of his isolation sinking in. He looked around, his eyes darting from one officer to the next, searching for a trace of loyalty, but finding only condemnation. Even the rookies had turned away from him, unwilling to follow his lead any longer. Alia took a step forward, her gaze unwavering. "It's over, Branson. Put the gun down. You don't have anyone left to back you up." For a moment he seemed to hesitate, his hand trembling as he looked down at the weapon in his grip. His eyes flicked back to Alia, filled with a hatred that went beyond anything she had ever seen. But behind the fury there was something else, a sense of defeat, a recognition that he had lost. Slowly, almost reluctantly, he lowered the gun, his shoulders slumping as the fight drained out of him. He looked away, unable to meet her gaze, his entire body radiating bitterness and shame. The officers moved forward, surrounding him, but this time it was to take him into custody. They stripped him of his badge and weapon, the weight of his actions finally catching up to him. As they led him to the squad car, Branson glanced over his shoulder, his eyes meeting Alias one last time. His face was a twisted mask of resentment, but Alia could see the fear behind it, the realization that he had lost everything. "This isn't over," he muttered, his voice barely audible. "You'll pay for this." But Alia simply watched as he was loaded into the car, refusing to give him the satisfaction of a response. She knew his threats were empty now, the words of a man stripped of his power, his authority, and his control. For the first time he was facing consequences he couldn't escape, and it was a reality he was entirely unprepared to handle. As the squad car pulled away, the remaining officers turned to Alia and her crew, a mixture of guilt and gratitude in their eyes. The young officer who had spoken up earlier approached her, his face solemn. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for standing up, for all of us." Alia nodded, acknowledging his courage. "It takes strength to do the right thing," she replied, "especially when it's not easy." He gave a faint nod, a look of respect in his eyes, and then he turned, joining the other officers as they dispersed, leaving the Brotherhood in peace. Alia watched them go, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction and relief. They had stood their ground, defended their rights, and exposed Branson for who he truly was. She knew the battle was far from over, that there would always be people like him trying to abuse their power. But tonight they had won a victory not just for themselves, but for everyone who had ever faced injustice. As she turned back to her crew, a feeling of pride swelled in her chest. They had stayed together, refused to be broken, and emerged stronger for it. Dex stepped forward, his face breaking into a rare, genuine smile. "We did it. Ace," he said, his voice filled with admiration. "You led us through hell, and we came out on top." Alia smiled, feeling the weight of the night lift from her shoulders. "We all did," she replied, looking around at the Brotherhood, "and we'll keep doing it. Together." The Brotherhood erupted in cheers, their voices ringing out into the night, a celebration of resilience, unity, and hard-won justice. A few days after Branson's arrest, the atmosphere around the Black Steel Brotherhood's clubhouse had transformed. There was a sense of relief, a feeling of triumph, and above all, a renewed sense of purpose. Word of what had happened spread quickly throughout the community. People who had once viewed the Brotherhood with suspicion now saw them as a group of defenders, ordinary people, standing up against corruption and abuse of power. Alelia was sitting at one of the long tables in the clubhouse, a stack of letters and cards in front of her. Over the past few days, messages had poured in from neighbors, local shop owners, and even strangers. Some were handwritten notes thanking her and the Brotherhood for their bravery. Others were donations for their legal defense fund, which, despite the overwhelming community support, they knew they might still need. Branson's arrest had been a victory, but they were realistic enough to know that they hadn't eliminated the issue altogether. There would always be others like him, lurking in positions of authority, ready to take advantage of the vulnerable. Dex walked over, dropping a newspaper on the table in front of her. The front page headline read, "Corrupt Cop Brought to Justice by Local Biker Group." The article detailed Branson's abuses, his manipulation of the system, and the courage of those who had dared to stand up to him. Alia felt a swell of satisfaction as she looked at the headline. It wasn't just about her or the Brotherhood, it was about every person who'd been silenced, every voice that had been dismissed because it didn't fit the narrative of those in power. "We did good, Ace," Dex said, crossing his arms with a proud smile. "People are finally seeing us for who we really are." Alia nodded, glancing around the room at her crew, who were laughing, talking, and sharing stories about the events of the last week. There was a newfound camaraderie among them, a sense that they had forged a bond stronger than anything that could be broken by threats or intimidation. The Brotherhood wasn't just a gang, it was a family, a community that protected its own. But as satisfying as the victory was, Alia knew it was only a step in a much larger journey. She took a deep breath and looked at Dex, her expression serious. "We're not done yet. Branson may be gone, but the system that enabled him is still there. We need to keep pushing, keep fighting. This is our chance to show that we're more than just a group of bikers." Dex nodded, understanding her completely. "You're right. We've got the community's attention now. We can't let this momentum slip away." Over the next few weeks, the Brotherhood became more involved in the neighborhood, organizing community events, speaking out at local council meetings, and even working with other grassroots organizations to address issues of police accountability and racial justice. They became a symbol of resilience, a beacon of hope for those who had felt powerless. The people who had once feared or misunderstood them now saw the Brotherhood as an essential part of the community's fabric, a group willing to protect and serve in their own way. One evening, as they were wrapping up a meeting at the clubhouse, a familiar face appeared at the door, the young officer who had spoken up during the standoff with Branson. He looked slightly nervous, but his expression was one of genuine respect. Alia walked over to greet him, her face warm with recognition. "Officer Jacobs," she said, extending a hand. "I didn't expect to see you here." He took her hand, nodding respectfully. I wanted to say thank you. I know I said it before, but after everything, I realized that standing up to Branson was one of the hardest things I've ever done. I wouldn't have had the courage to do it without you and your crew showing that it was possible." Alia smiled, feeling a sense of pride not only for herself but for the Brotherhood and the ripple effect they had created. "Sometimes it just takes one person to make a difference," she said. "But it's easier when we know we're not alone." Jacobs looked around the clubhouse, taking in the faces of the people he had once been told were a menace to the community. He saw laughter, warmth, and resilience, and he knew he had been wrong to believe the stereotypes. "If you ever need anything," he said, his voice steady, "you know where to find me. I'm here to help." With a respectful nod, he left, leaving behind a quiet understanding that bridges were being built between them and the very system that had once seen them as adversaries. It was a small step, but a meaningful one. As the door closed behind him, Dex turned to Alayar, a glint of satisfaction in his eyes. "I never thought I'd see the day when we had a cop on our side." Alayar chuckled, a sense of accomplishment filling her. "The world changes when you stand up for what's right," she said, "and it feels good to know that we can make a difference, even in small ways." The Brotherhood raised their glasses in a toast to new beginnings and to the strength it took to stay united, even in the face of adversity. They knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, that there would always be those who would see them as outsiders. But they had learned that their strength wasn't in their numbers or their bikes or even their reputation. It was in their unity, their unwavering commitment to each other, and their belief in justice. As Alayar looked around at the faces of her friends and family, she felt a profound sense of purpose. They were more than a biker gang. They were a force for change. And as long as they rode together, nothing could stop them.